All right, today we're going to be looking again at the slice. Last time we talked about the idea of not this, which is incidental, but much more of this or this, the leverage component. What are the specific mechanics? How is that tied to the source material? What makes us think that this is a good way of thinking about Schneiden? And what are the implications from here? All right, Jeff Tsai, Forte Swordplay. So we're going to be continuing on our exploration of the so-called Schneiden or slice term. Last time we had introduced some key mechanics about it, and I think a really important thing to understand about what we're doing in general with this term is actually, it's not the first time we've been looking at this. Like the folks in HEMA, historical European martial arts, have been aware of this term and this concept in the German tradition for many years. But you don't see it very often, potentially in tournament or really in fencing. And I think there are a few reasons for that. Part of it, when it comes from a tournament perspective, competitive perspective, if the concept of the slice is really based on more of a grappling, infighting perspective, a lot of the fencing that's done more and more these days is sort of closer to modern Olympic fencing, which is at further distance. There's a single touch, the engagement stops. So if you're doing something that requires more extended exchanges where you're closer and you can actually bind and wind and do a lot of that kind of mechanic, things that are related to, for instance, elbow pushes, this idea is not going to show up very easily. So we're definitely sort of in an area where we're doing active research, which is really fantastic from my perspective, because it means that there's actually cool things that have yet to be discovered. And I think the slice, Schneiden, is actually almost like a really great metaphor for where I think we're at with HEMA in general, particularly the German tradition. There's more to be discovered, more to come. So pretty exciting stuff. I think apologies in advance. The stuff that we're going to talk about today, there's going to be a lot of stuff to actually cover. So I am almost guaranteeing that there's going to be things I forget or things that are going to evolve in the next few months on this particular topic. So actually, like, share, and subscribe if you'd like to actually see follow-ups on where we're at in just a little bit in a few months. Okay, so moving into like the stuff we want to talk about today, aside from actually seeing this happen in action, one of the other things that has been difficult in trying to figure out what the slice is, kind of dig deeper into it over the course of the past 20 years, is also the data itself. So if the slice itself, Schneiden, is not really described or defined in very many places. So we'll actually today go through the specific few areas where we can actually look at where they sort of define how it's done. But aside from those few places in some of the early sources like Dobringer and Ringeck and von Danzig, most of the other citations for slice are, hey, do the slice in order to move on to a next part or whatever. It's often a connecting piece. And so if you don't have a good idea of like what the slice is, now you're just kind of, I'll use the term cherry picking, but you're trying to apply things like, hey, I want to try to do a draw slice in a certain situation to go from one technique to the other. And if the draw slice on its own is not sufficient, now you're stuck, right? So on the converse side, if you have an idea of how to do the slice, which is actually more applicable than just that draw slice, if this lever idea holds water and actually allows us to actually connect some of these techniques, it should potentially allow us to unlock more sequences that depend on the slice in later sources like Paulus, Hector, Meyer, and Joachim Meyer, which again we're going to be looking at in coming months. So okay, so I think before we get into specific data sources, the other thing I want to really mention is just a couple key points about the mechanics. We've already talked about the lever aspect, right? So when I make contact, like I can be levering upward for a low slice or levering downward for a high slice. Notice also the contact point. I've been doing this, kind of showing it on the forearm, which is, you know, the furthest out, closest to me. But there are times, for instance, if we bind here and actually, if you wind to my head, right? If we get into this kind of situation, all of a sudden, when I attempt to actually do that connection to the lever, I can go here, but it's actually easier in this case to actually get here. So in terms of the idea of the elbow push, I can push here, but I can push even better here, right? So the contact point is another thing to think about. Forearm, upper arm, and actually when I do that push, notice that, so if I manage to sort of push this out of the way, the head all of a sudden also becomes a potential target. And that is worth mentioning because a number of the instances of the slice that are mentioned later on are in fact things like slice to the head. And again, well, what does that even mean? If you're thinking about like, hey, why would I do a draw slice to the head? Makes less sense than if I'm actually pushing the person away and that head ends up sort of in the way of that push with the blade. So the one other thing before we get into the sources that I think hopefully is exciting for people, and I admit I have a bias, people like me that are potentially not as tall as some of my opponents some of the time. If we get into that bind and I get that push and I go here, it gets pretty exciting to me that all of a sudden now I actually have a nice thing where I can, it's not just a draw, but I can really get underneath and push up and really disrupt someone, uproot them, which again, if you're already vertically challenged, this is another potentially really great tool to be able to use in free fencing or in tournaments, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, lots of real cool potential to this technique. So let's get into some of the data and details. This next section, now we're really going to get into actual some of the text and historical data reasons for thinking the way that we're thinking. Notice one of the reasons I'm specifically using sticks because one of the things I want to emphasize is that it's the lever that's the important part. It's less about the edge, right? So everything really should work even if there isn't pain compliance as a major driver. And not saying that pain compliance is not a driver, but that, you know, there are other things in addition to it that may actually be more effective. So yeah, if you are thinking about actually trying to use this technique, I actually encourage people trying to use sticks, because if you make it work with a stick, it's only going to be that much more effective with a blade. So that being said, okay, where did we come up with this idea to begin with? One of the sources that really helped crack it for me was, again, kind of looking at stuff that people have not had an opportunity to kind of dig into as much. The earlier sources, as I mentioned, Dobringer, Ringek, von Danzig, like people have looked at that for years, and we are going to look at those sources in a little bit. But Paul's Hector Meyer, give me 1 second. We're looking at technique number 37, which is a high slice with the scalper. We're not going to do the whole interpretation. We're just going to look at the very first sentence, which is really the key. So the first sentence reads, item, when you come to your opponent in the onset, step forward with your left foot and cut in long to his right over his arms. Thus you can slice him below or above. And it's that slice him from below or above piece, which is the thing that's really telling to me. So if you give me like a left Oberhau, like a left, yeah, so you're cutting from here. So actually, if we switch for a second, this is the setup. This is what it should look like. As he cuts basically a scalper to my head, I'm actually coming here. Regardless of how I'm getting here, the key is that from here, I am supposed to be able to do both a high and a low slice. And so I think a lot of people, this one makes sense. This high slice makes sense. But I think a lot of people have this tendency to think like, I want to disengage to get to that slice. And if you're here, like it's really sort of like you're in contact. It seems really odd to actually try to get to this guy or to this guy when this, you know, this thing is in your face, right? So from here, how do you execute a low slice? Maybe it's not about letting go. Maybe the definition of a low slice is in fact something else, right? So this is where this whole idea of this lever down, lever up, all of a sudden kind of was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. So it's funny how just like a little phrase like that and a little situation where you know you're in close and you can't really let go with the blade, and you still have to get underneath somehow, all of a sudden, light bulb. Okay, so that was the bit which was really insightful for me. So now, let's take that idea and how does that reconcile against like the earlier commentaries for the German tradition? So, okay, so let's go ahead and flip around here. So this is basically going to break down in terms of the high slice and low slice into a couple of scenarios. So we could spend a lot of time kind of reading through the text. I'm going to save that time. And again, I'm going to throw text up on the screen and you guys can just kind of read along. A lot of you will be very familiar with these definitions of the 4 slices, right? So there's kind of 2 scenarios that are being discussed. One, they start with talking about like the definition of the high slice, right? So what's basically going on is we get into a bind and there's a situation where there's going to be some sort of cutting around, right? So I displace enough pressure where like it looks like I'm sort of leaving the center unguarded. So he's going to come around. And so that leads very nicely into this guy, right? So very naturally, I can certainly go above and go down. A lot of the time, so he's doing it in a way where the point is high, hands low, but he can also do a spheric when he cuts around, right? So boom, yep, so it's spheric, yep, spheric over to here, this guy, yep. So when he does that, again, makes it easy to get on top and push down. So that's the explanation for the high slice. Okay, so now the other thing that we haven't really talked about is the other-sidedness of this, right? So we just kind of displayed going from a right foot forward bind on, as if you were cutting from the right side. So now we're actually going to switch to the other side. If we go from here, and again, if he cuts around to that other side, for me to get to that position, nice and easy, right? The other thing that's actually, so that's from both sides, I can get on top and basically push down. So one more time from here, when he goes to the other side, whether it's, yep, this or the spheric, that's what that kind of looks like. From here, other side, boom, if I can get to that. That's that high slice. So now, now that we've done the high slice piece, let's talk about the low slice. So rather than a cutting around scenario, what's described is if the person's arms go up, right? So I think we showed this a little bit earlier. Classic scenario of that is from here, if again, I kind of give enough, instead of like pushing too far here, in fact, let's say heart of the sword, right? If I'm not heart of the sword, he cuts around. If I'm not heart of the sword, so he comes back, right? So from here, he's going to want to just like wind or whack me in the head, like basically shield to my head, right? So from here, so he's driving upward, forward. And again, now all of a sudden, this transition becomes super easy, right? So from here, I can go not only to here, but depending, like I can even potentially get to here, which, is that pleasant? No, not particularly, right? So now this is a case where sticks, it works great with sticks. Doing okay? Yeah. Okay, so it works great with sticks. In fact, let's show the other side. So from here, we're here, you can again wind to my head, boom. So from here, I can get this guy just as well. But you'll notice, now if we switch to blades, so while the edges are not that important for the leverage component, they can help. The flat and the edges can actually help in this case. So again, if we just start standard bind on with your right foot forward, you wind to my head from here, great. From here, I can switch to this guy, right? So notice I'm sort of pushing like this way. So with this flat, and so sort of, if I'm going to sort of like think about shaving, right, that's sort of a little bit of pin compliance, that's going to be with my long edge, okay? But notice what happens on the other side. So if we bind here, right, and he cuts a, so I'm weak and he's going to wind this guy, right? One more time. So from here, boom, when I come in, again, there's that, I can push this way, but because of the flat and the mechanics, like I can do this, but notice how my wrist is kind of weak if he puts pressure here. Rather than doing this, I can just turn here, and in the same way that you think about spheric, that thumb underneath, push upward, very, very strong from that position. So the edge and the flat of the sword is not required, but you can use it to your advantage in terms of those mechanics. So that all lines up with, basically what's said by Ringegg, von Danzig, Dobringer for the high slice and the low slice. And as I mentioned earlier, like this is an active area of research. So I'm going to give you an example of an area where I think I have an idea about stuff, but I would encourage people to think about this, write stuff in the comments. Would love to hear, you agree with this, you disagree, like what are the pros and cons of all of these things? One of the areas where I think I need to think about this more is the section prior to the 4 slices. There's something which is called the Abschneiden section. They mentioned Abschneiden, that term in particular. You can translate that as slicing off or cutting off. And what's being discussed is the idea that it really doesn't have anything specifically to do with the lever mechanic, but it really sort of ends with the idea of actually using a Schnappen. It defines Schnappen as a counter to if you start from below and there's a cut from above. So if you cut over to here and we get into this situation, right? So he suppresses me. So he's suppressing, and it says, come up quickly with the short edge, right? So from here, so for him to avoid getting potentially hit, he pushes down, and then that allows me to basically cut around and basically do a Schnappen. And similarly, we could do the other side. From here, I can Schnappen and go here, right? So that's what's happening in that section that talks about Abschneiden. And one of my questions had always sort of been, what does that have to do with like the slices, like the 4 slices? And I think what may be going on is, if you notice, the first thing that we just talked about with the 4 slices, the high slice, remember the setup is from here, if I push and he cuts around, I can do the slice. And if you think about it, that's what a Schnappen is, right? So from here, if I do this, he can snap around and do that thing. So I think maybe what's going on is that Abschneiden section is actually a lead up in saying, okay, if you give the person a reason to do a Schnappen, here's an answer for it, the high slice. So current working theory, and that's what we have there. The other thing that happens after the 4 slice section is the Händedrücken, and we've kind of talked about this in the previous video, but again, just for completeness, this kind of gets into the idea of like counters to the slices, right? So now, if we just kind of set up a situation here where I'm going to get into a slice, right? So in fact, I'm going to try to get into a situation with the low slice. In fact, actually, let's do from here, and I'm actually going to give you a weak response. So you just wind to my head. So I go from here and I get into that low slice situation from here. One of the things that he can do, if you just kind of come forward a little bit more, just so there's space on the camera, from here, whenever there's pressure, in fact, Joachim Meyer makes this comment about, hey, most people, when they're faced with a slice, they don't know what to do about it. Like most people don't know how to deal with it because obviously there's going to be a lot of pressure. So even though he doesn't tell us what to do, if we sort of think about martial arts in general. And we think particularly like if the idea is like this is an elbow push, right? A very simple thing to do against an elbow push is drop the elbow, right? So if I'm really pushing here, right, as long as he drops that elbow like that, he takes that away from me. So how do you apply that? So from here, if I've gotten to this, so one of the things he can do is he can just make space, just bring this down, and all of a sudden that takes that slice away from me. So just bringing your sword down can relieve that pressure. The other thing you can do in terms of relieving pressure, let's switch it for a second. So from here, I do this, and if you do that slice on me, yep, so boom, and you're gonna push up, right? So as I said, I can bring this down to at least take that pressure away. The other thing I can do is turn away from it, right? So from here, I can do things like this. So I can basically rotate in a way to actually take that pressure away. There's a fun picture in the Jörg Wilhelm manuscript. These are a couple of sort of practical research ideas that we're kind of looking into so that we not only understand the technique of the slice, but also, well, what do you do to counter it, right? So, yeah, so I think that's a good spot to stop in terms of some of the key historical data that I think everyone should be aware of so that, you know, don't take my word for this stuff. Go take a look at the sources, use these concepts and see if these concepts track against what's actually being described in those various glosses. Okay, so last section here, I want to be setting a precedent for kind of ending these videos with thinking about the future, right? And the idea that like what we're doing here is we're constantly thinking about reconstruction. We're constantly thinking about, do we have this stuff right? Like, are we actually reconstructing what the data and the art and all of that is supposed to be? So along those lines, let's talk about confidence level. So right now, my experience looking at the early tradition sort of definition of Schneiden, and then the various instances where we can make heads or tails of actual places where they say do the slice without giving more detail. All of those, I think, are better served with the idea of a leverage or rocking kind of mechanic in addition to the drawing slice, as opposed to just doing a drawing slice interpretation. So, you know, I encourage everyone, obviously, take this idea, see what you can make of it. Again, I think it's a really exciting time to kind of be re-looking at some of these things that maybe we thought we had it all figured out, but maybe we can actually get it better, right? So I think that's very exciting. That being said, okay, so confidence level, I would say on a scale of 1 to 5, before I was at probably a 2, like a 1.5 of like, do we really understand the slice? Now, I think this jumps us up much closer to sort of like a 3.5. 3.5, maybe a 4, but I want to see more examples where if they just say, do the slice, and then here's another set of techniques that like, you have to continue from that position. I want to see if like this helps crack more of that. So the more that we talk about things like Joachim Meyer and Paulus Hector Meyer and some of the later tradition stuff that really talks more about the slice and uses it, I think there are opportunities for us to really try to validate that idea. So stay tuned for that, and like, share, subscribe if you want to see, you know, some of those follow-ups. Other areas where I think I still don't have like good answers for, these guys. So we've actually switched to fetters, right? So thanks very much to Siggy for making these light Siggy fetters. So you certainly see this idea of like these Schilts. Sometimes they're called pairing hooks, or things that are kind of related to pairing hooks. If you think about it, now all of a sudden, if we're actually using the same idea and all of a sudden transitioning to here, all of a sudden, like these guys, these are already, they're already dangerous. They can certainly be dangerous. And the idea of actually trying to come up with the strong of the sword and actually using it as not just a drawing slice, but actually a lever, this really, this becomes, you know, even more, if you're looking for pain compliance, this is definitely a way to do it, if not actually harming the other person. So, you know, if that really was intended as more of like an elbow control kind of situation, is this good or bad? Like, does that make sense that they would actually want these there if it actually makes these more dangerous? So that's one thing for sure. The other thing that I really kind of want to look at is everything that was kind of described source-wise was really defining, execute the slice, execute Schneiden from above or below, from a bind, right? So the idea was from here, right? If I'm strong and he cuts around, I do that thing. Or if I'm weak and he can wind in, then I can do this and I can go up, right? But all of those are from the bind. But I think one tantalizing suggestion that like you don't have to do it from a bind is that Paulus Hector Meyer example where he cuts from above and I just sort of cut in and really sort of cover that line and get there early, not necessarily to like kill him immediately, but actually to just be safe and actually take that center, right? So as we maybe practice this more, and we need to develop more things like drills and all that kind of stuff, the more that we get some proficiency behind this, does that increased confidence allow us to also execute slices potentially more from out of distance in addition to from the bind? So all things that I think are worth looking at and thinking about. So hopefully we'll come back to this topic in a few weeks or months. And until that time, see you guys next time.